So Nick, three big ideas of today: popular sovereignty, natural rights, and rule of law. You're going to go through each one of these for us to tell us what the heck they are, where did the idea come from, and why did we put it as a part of our country and our government and our structure of how we are in our system, our American system. But one more thing I'm going to get to ask you with, and I'll ask you as we go through. You're going to have to give us examples, Nick, of where we see these things play out today. Because it's not just a document 233 years ago, almost 233 years old. It's a document that we live around today and we utilize today. So that's the charge today. Tell us what it means, why we have it, and why should we care? Because we should.
All right, so, well, we'll start with popular sovereignty, and this will be the easiest to point to an example in the Constitution itself. And it's right there. If you look to your side there, you can see three big words standing out: we the people, which you hear a lot from the National Constitution Center. That's in the preamble of the Constitution, which of course we can also read in full. So I'm just going to pull up the preamble if I can, because I think
it's a little hard to read the fancy script.
Yeah, it is hard to read the fancy script, and I think that would be helpful for us. So the preamble reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And so what's important there, right, is we'll talk more about that preamble and how it sort of sets the guidelines and structure for the Constitution. And we'll do that actually over the course of many of these classes. But the big point here is that it also says who ultimately holds power, right? That's we the people, right? We call this, we're talking about popular sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word that's notoriously difficult for scholars to define, but generally speaking, sovereignty is referring to a source of political power, right? Where does political power come from? Sovereignty is a claim to that, right? So the idea of popular sovereignty is that political power doesn't derive from, say, in a monarchy, a king is ordained by God, right? Or in an autocracy or something like that, right? A dictator simply takes over and claims power. Instead, it's bestowed on them by the people, because the people themselves create and ratify a government, right? And in the case of the Constitution, the preamble means not only does it set this principle down, right, that the people themselves ultimately hold power, but that they also articulate these certain goals for the Constitution, right? This order that we're creating, what is the purpose of it, right? The people are the rulers, right? They're the fundamental source of power. And the purposes of this are common, right? They're common defense, they're peace, right? Things like that, right? This is what we're going for, right? General welfare is another term you hear, right? And so I think that's what important is to see there, right? That notion of popular sovereignty is set forth immediately in the preamble itself, right? So that's popular sovereignty, and as I said, it's easy to point to in the Constitution. Natural rights. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask real quick, because I always think when I hear the word sovereignty, I think king. So the idea of popular, meaning, people, so the people are the king, like in a simpler kind of like way to break it down. And so I think it's really important to kind of like to pull those together. Do you want to jump to natural rights, or do you want to walk through, jump to natural rights and go through those pieces too?
Yeah, and I should say that it's a good way of thinking of it, right? Is that the king claims to be sovereign in that all that he rules over stems from that ultimate power, right? Including the colonies themselves, right, claim to get their power from the king's sovereignty, right? And then later Parliament claimed sovereignty, right? So that's what that word's about, right? Who's claiming power? That's basically what we're talking about. And here we're talking about the people themselves. Natural rights, We'll get to the parts of the Constitution that refer to this, but really here, it's good to start with the Declaration of Independence as being the most obvious document that deals with natural rights. And natural rights is an idea, is one that we can clearly find roots in the Enlightenment itself. The Enlightenment generally is a intellectual, and scientific, and cultural movement of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. I say that knowing that scholars, of course, disagree about exactly where that lines up, but that's generally what it is. Part of this is political philosophy and moral philosophy that comes out of it. One of the great articulations is John Locke, right? John Locke was a powerful influence upon the founders of this country. And one of his ideas was that rights come from God or nature. That's what natural rights are. In other words, they're rights that are not bestowed on you by a state or a government itself, but instead they're rights that inhere in you as a human being by your very birth, right? And why is that important? Because it helps to explain, and we'll talk about this as we go for the First Amendment, especially, but certainly many of the other parts of the Bills of Rights. It explains some of these fundamental rights that the founding generation believed in, like the right to conscience, right? The idea that your thoughts, your feelings, the ideas within yourself cannot be alienated or given over to a government to be controlled, because they are part of your essential being. You are born with them, right? It is a natural right of being a human being. So Kerry, you can bring in a question if you have it, but I thought that might be a good example to start with, and we can mention the Declaration as well too.
Yeah, I think we can dive in deeper when we'll get to the questions when we dive into deeper to each one. Can you big picture go over rule of law? And then I have one question before we leave this slide. So
Sure.
big picture, what's the idea behind rule of law? And then one question of how they all work together.
Yes. So the big idea behind the rule of law is that we are a government of laws, not a government by man or by arbitrary rule. I should note that this connects then to sovereignty itself, right? We have to keep in mind the experience that this founding generation had under what they believed to be despotic rule of King George, right, in the British monarchy. The idea that the problem there was that this wasn't rule by law, but rule by an absolute monarch and his minions, right, who were arbitrarily deciding who had broken the law and putting them in jail, right? That was a complaint, for instance, about the 1774 intolerable acts, amongst other things, right? That they were arbitrary, meaning that they were solely based upon the decision of individual human beings, right? To be arbitrary is the will of another human being, right? As opposed to the law itself, right? So the rule of law is saying we don't construct a system based on what individual officials or rulers decide should be the law at one time to be applied to one person. Instead, the law is designed to apply equally to all, right? That's the concept. So that's the big idea, right? And therefore, as a result of that, no one is above the law, right? That's an important principle too, right? Is again taking from experience the British monarchy, right? Other systems that the founders observed that tended to be despotic or totalitarian. That the problem was that the rulers were ultimately above the law, right? They could not, in other words, be controlled, and importantly, by the people, right? There was no mechanism for them to ensure everybody operated under the same set of rules and laws. So that's the rule of law, right? And Curry, I'm sorry, did you say you wanted me to give a good example of that, or just to
Well, let's get into the dive in deep of where they came from. So we'll dive into where popular sovereignty came from. Natural rights, you kind of hinted a little bit at it already, but it can go back even further. And then rule of law. One of the questions that I had for the students was, as you think about these three, and this might be hard to answer right now, how do you see them kind of jigsawing and fitting together like puzzle pieces? And so Lauren shared from in the chat box all three enforce equality around those pieces. And I keep thinking in my head, do I want to make a pyramid and do natural rights at the bottom, popular sovereignty in the middle, and rule of law at the top? But I want you guys to be thinking about that. How do these three concepts play out? And Nick's going to walk you through the documents they play out in, but how do they play out in our country, and how do they work together to make up the system that we believe in? So that's the big question that we're going to go through, Nick. But let's dive deep and dig into a little bit more into popular sovereignty. Do you want to start with Thomas Paine?
Yeah, because I was going to say, you skip over that first slide because we already just talked about that. But speaking of somebody who didn't particularly like the British monarchy, there's Thomas Paine. If you read anything Thomas Paine wrote, he really did not like the monarchy. He did not like the idea that the king could claim sole authority on the basis of divine right, not rule by the people, but by other means, right? And as you see this quote here from Paine, a constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government. And a government without a constitution is power without right, right? And there actually, I think within what Paine is saying, you can see the intersection of these things, right? That a constitution needs to be an act of a people, right? And the power has to derive, and as he says at the end, right, a government without a constitution is power without right, right? In order to have that rule of law, you also have to have the proper foundation, which is popular sovereignty and natural rights, right? That's what Curry's kind of suggesting, right? By either a pyramid or maybe like Jenga pieces or something like that, right? You need to have all of them in there, right? You can't just have one. And I'll note Thomas Paine, for those of you who don't know, Thomas Paine is a revolutionary, right, who wrote Common Sense at the beginning of the revolution in 1776, which was essentially a bestseller for its time, right? They didn't have a bestseller list, but it was widely read and articulated the principles of the revolution in its early days before the Declaration of Independence. And as I noted, Paine was very much a harsh critic of monarchy, right? And therefore he thought popular sovereignty was really important. So where does the idea of popular sovereignty come from? Well, there's two really important principles we should discuss here that help to explain the framers' worldview, right? How they understood things. One of those is another one of these Enlightenment ideas, and that's of social contract, right? You can find social contract theory in the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau or John Locke or others, right? The basic idea here, right, is that the social contract is between the people and the state or the rulers, and it says the duties and obligations of both, right? In other words, to have a social contract means that you, the citizen, you will get defense, right? The state will defend your rights. It has certain obligations to you, right? Like the general welfare mentioned in the preamble. But then you as a citizen also have duties to your fellow citizens and to the state, right? Certain things that you submit to as part of being a citizen. So that's the social contract, right? The other concept of that is what we call republicanism. We're referring not to the Republican Party, but small r republicanism, which is a political theory. It is the idea of self-rule, right? This need to turn away from monarchy and hereditary rule, like Thomas Paine is talking about, and towards self-rule and rule of the people, right? So republicanism is about self-rule. Popular sovereignty is saying that that rule and the power is derived from the people themselves, right? So they work together in the constitutional system, and it's really important to see how those ideas interact.
I'm going to share a couple of things with you, just as people are listening to you, they're kind of processing through the question, which I'm so glad you guys are doing that. That's super smart. So from Mountain Trail Middle School in Phoenix, Jason says they show that all the people are created equal. So this idea that people have voice, people have agency, to him believes that they are created equal. Jordan says that they show that everyone should be treated equally. And then Lauren adds this. Lauren adds natural rights lead to popular sovereignty. which then needs rule of law to succeed. So I love that kind of like tracker on that direction that Lauren kind of spelled out really quickly. But guys, keep processing through this, because I hate to use this analogy because it's corny, but it's like a three-legged stool, and how do they support each other? And how do they need each other to work in a system? So, okay, so popular sovereignty. I'm going to speed you up, Nick. We have 15 minutes left.
Yep. We have to do natural rights now, or what do we do next?
Yeah, I mean, it's your
choice. You want to talk about the
'cause
Federalist Papers?
I know you want to talk about the Federalist Papers, even though I think, is that next week's, no, 2 weeks from now, we have a Federalist Papers class.
Yeah.
But do you want to, the popular sovereignty and the idea came out during the Federalist Papers. And so when we look back and say, where does the idea come from? We can look to the Federalist Papers. Can you tell everybody what are the Federalist Papers? And then where is it written in some of those pieces?
Sure. So there's a couple questions there. The Federalist Papers are a series of essays, 85 in total, that were written primarily by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and John Jay then wrote 5. So it was really Hamilton wrote 51 and Madison wrote 29. And the reason they wrote these papers, which were mostly published in New York City, was to respond to criticism to the Constitution. So when we celebrate Constitution Day on the 17th, that's the day that the Constitution was signed. And then when they signed the Constitution, they submitted it to the states for ratification. Now, we'll talk about those ratification debates, as Kerry mentioned, in 2 weeks. But the Federalist Papers, they were written to respond to critics of the Constitution who were saying we shouldn't ratify. So they had to look for big justifications, right? Because there's a big picture here, right? They have to get to the big ideas to sell people on this Constitution, right? And there were people at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia who articulated the importance of popular sovereignty. Men like Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson of Pennsylvania thought it was very important, and in fact thought the Constitution didn't commit to it enough, right? That the people should have even greater role in picking their representatives and rulers, including the president and senators, right, amongst other things. So there was a debate about that. When it came to justifying the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, Madison, who was less committed to it during the convention, now really stuck to it as a core principle behind the Constitution. And even here, right, is we didn't just go in secret and create this Constitution. What we did here is we did an act of popular sovereignty, because the thing is, we put this Constitution together, but we're submitting it to you, the people. So not only the purposes of the Constitution to create rule by the people, we're submitting it to the people. The ratification process itself has to do with the people submitting and agreeing to this Constitution, right? So that's, we'll get into ratification more.
I'm going to laugh at that in a minute for just 1 second, everybody. Like, so Nick is absolutely right. They said they gave it back to the people. They wrote this Constitution over the summer, September 17th, which is next week, by the way, and we're going to have Neil Gorsuch speaking, so join us. But they did write it in secret.
They did.
So they spent from May to September writing it in secret. And then when they were done, they said, here it is. So it's funny because I love how Madison comes back and says, don't worry, this is all about the people, even though we didn't do most of it with the people. Now,
I'll just mention very quickly, now that's part of when we get to the ratification debates, and I know we're going to get to this, but that's part of exactly what the critics were saying. Is the critics were saying, well, we don't disagree. We believe in republicanism and popular sovereignty. We just don't think that this Constitution is sufficiently committed to it, right? So actually part of the disagreement was about how committed the Constitution was to this. In other words, the people really cared about the significance of popular sovereignty, right? It was a very real thing, in other words, in 1787 and 1788, right? So we should just keep that in mind.
So I want to let everybody know we're definitely going to get to the Bill of Rights, because I know there's some questions in there about the Bill of Rights.
There has to be.
And my God,
natural rights is going to help us get there.
Natural rights is going to help us get there, but also I'm going to throw at Eddie's comment here, because I think it's totally honest when talking about popular sovereignty. But it was only a rich white man who could vote on the Constitution. And that idea is, when they talk about the people are sovereign, who are the people that they're talking about? So hit that real quick, Nick, and then we'll jump to natural rights.
Yes. So I think we talked about this with voting before. It's true in some places more than others because state constitutions are what created voting rights and decided who were citizens and what rights they got. So it actually depends on what states you're looking at because Vermont and Pennsylvania, for instance, had wider suffrage, but yes, for men specifically, but wider suffrage. New Jersey, of course, as we talk about in our 19th Amendment exhibit that just opened, women were allowed to vote for 30 years until 1807. So at least when the Constitution was ratified, to some extent, it depended on where you are. It's much more true in the southern colonies, especially South Carolina and Georgia, which were really committed at the time to plantation slavery. It was much more true there that really we're only talking about the planter class or the landed rich white men who could vote. Because also there were plenty of free blacks who were voting early in the Republic, right? Laws that took away black voting rights, a lot of those were passed in the 19th century before the Civil War. So it wasn't actually true at the time of ratification. So one way we explain this is sort of there's an ebb and flow, right? There's periods of expansion, there's periods of collapse, and then we see what happens in the Civil War and Reconstruction. So that's a way of saying it's more complicated, but it's partly because they left it to the states.
Yeah, so you're right. But Nick, that ebb and flow, that kind of in and out is fascinating because then we see there's this moment of people really believing in natural rights
Yep.
after the Constitution is ratified, this idea that everybody has, a power and a right amongst themselves because they exist. So
Yes.
dive into natural rights really quickly. 7 minutes.
Yeah. Well, now we see the declaration here, but I want to take a chance because Kerry served it up, and that's to say we're going to get to this really shortly. But keep in mind that means that women and free blacks, but also slaves, would have heard this rhetoric, and they believed it too. So that's part of what makes the revolutionary rhetoric and the Constitution, the rights, these ideas we're talking about, they're so powerful that everyone can hear them and understand them, right? That's part of their power, is they're beyond the people who write them and come up with them, right? There's a real force behind them. The Declaration, as I noted, is maybe the most obvious example of natural rights. So most of you surely have heard these words before, but the Declaration says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? That people have the right to create new governments and abolish them. They put everything in there, by the way, right? You notice that. There's a little bit about rule of law, but there's plenty about popular sovereignty. It's about the consent of the governed, right? The governed, the people have to consent to government. And we're talking about natural rights, right? I mentioned unalienable rights, the idea that, for instance, the right to conscience, right? Your ideas within your head, your beliefs, right? Whatever they are things within you that you are not fully controllable, and therefore you cannot give away or alienate them to a ruler or to a state, right? They're unalienable in that sense, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's the classic articulation of the basic natural rights, right? That these things government must be created to protect, right? That's one of the things that it has to serve, right? Are these basic essential needs and rights of all people, right? That's really key. And equality is in there, right? Somebody mentioned that earlier, right? Is part of these three things we're talking about. That's all within this short statement in the Declaration. And I said I was gonna say this, but people heard this and they immediately did things with it, right? So Prince Hall, for instance, which I think we talked about in the spring when we talked about slavery in the Constitution, but he immediately petitioned the Massachusetts legislature and used the words in the Declaration of Independence and said we should abolish slavery right now because look at these words. It goes against natural rights and natural order. And Massachusetts, only a couple years later, the Supreme Court would in fact abolish slavery in that state, right? On some of those very arguments, right? So there is a very real power to that idea. Now, the Bill of Rights, the clearest articulation of the idea of natural rights comes in the Ninth Amendment. If you look at the words in the Ninth Amendment, it reserves all. Let me look this.
You're gonna Google
yeah,
it
no,
directly?
I know. I was losing it
Somebody
for a second.
asked earlier, and the way that we've been always taught this and kind of the understanding is looking at these documents is the Declaration sets up this idea of natural rights. The Constitution tries to begin to weave in natural rights, popular sovereignty, and rule of law. And then the Bill of Rights like wraps everything together in a bow. It's like this is my only sports analogy you will ever hear out of me. It's like a hat trick in hockey, 3 and then you get the win. The natural rights really come through in some of the Bill of Rights. So those 3 documents work together like those 3 big ideas. And then for the bonus question, everybody, what is the amendment? And this is a hard question, so sorry for the hard one. What's the amendment that makes the Bill of Rights stick to the states and apply to the states? Maybe a minute to answer that in the chat box. There's a couple really good points going on in the chat box right here that the government has power only when given to it by the people. Good job, guys. Nice answers on that one. The power people give the government power.
Milo seems like he got it right.
He did get it right.
Yes, the 14th Amendment applies the Bill of Rights to the people.
Yes, and Eddie also shared that the 9th plays a part in that. So good job for both of you, Milo and Eddie.
I was trying to make sure
too. Good job.
Well, the 10th reserves the rights to the states that were not given to the national government, right?
So let's go over
retaining reserved rights. The 9th is, I suggested, right? I was just trying to make sure I got the text exactly correct. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. There are 2 reasons for putting this in there, right? One of those is the Bill of Rights wasn't really created by the Anti-Federals. The Anti-Federals are the ones who wanted a Bill of Rights and demanded one, the people who opposed the Constitution. But it was James Madison who really crafted the Bill of Rights in Congress, right? So it looked a little bit different from what they wanted. The other is they didn't want the Bill of Rights to just be the set of rights they got, right? In other words, here are your 8 amendments. Those are the rights you get. You don't get any others, right? Well, everyone, I think, could agree that would be a bad idea, right? Because part of the reason some people oppose the Bill of Rights is say, well, if you articulate some rights and not others, do you not protect those rights? Do you give more power to the government by doing that? So the 9th Amendment was there to say, look, just because things aren't articulated doesn't mean they don't exist. And many have interpreted that to mean natural rights, right? In other words, that there are rights retained by the people. We don't list them here, but they're natural. They exist otherwise, or they're pre-existing rights. In other words, they're pre-constitutional rights that cannot also be disparaged by the government, if that makes sense.
Government can't step on those rights. It's the easiest way I remember. Okay, so in the bottom of the 9th, Nick, bring it home. What is the rule of law and how does it work?
That's 2 sports metaphors, by the way.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay,
I just did another one.
I don't even notice it. And then I'm going to share what AJ shared with me from Mountain Trail Middle School, because it's a great way to kind of share that way that AJ's understanding these pieces as well.
Yes. So we're moving on to rule of law, and sorry, Kerry, do you just want me to give a good example here?
Give us a big idea. What is the rule of law again? Because we hit it in the beginning, and we're wrapping it up with the rule of law. An example of it and how it works with the other 2 to make it functional, like Lauren suggested earlier.
Yeah, so a couple things, right? One is I noted when we looked at the declaration there, right? Those three ideas are all there, right? I mean, you see in there that the complaint is, as I noted earlier, that the monarch, the King of England, was unaccountable to the people, right? And that allowed for arbitrary despotism, which was the opposite of rule of the law, right? It was rule by one man by arbitrary power. And that was a problem, right? They could look back to antiquity in Caligula of Rome is a classic example of when rule of law is violated, right? Famously, for instance, Caligula supposedly was able to get one of his horses named a senator, right? The idea there, right, is of course it looks like a collapse of society, but it also shows that rule of law was not applying, right? It was ruled by one man, the emperor, who decided, right, what would be established. He also wrote the law in small print and posted it up so high on a pillar that no one could ever read it and know their legal responsibilities. Why does that go against the rule of law? Well, rule of law depends on the people being able to understand and know the laws, to be able to follow them, to have what we call notice, right? You have to know what the law is. And the law has to treat people equally and fairly and present advance notice, as I noted, right, of what's to be expected. And this is in the Constitution, right? So there are a couple examples. I think a good one to point out is that the Constitution in Article 1, Section 10, and Section 9, both for states and the federal government, they cannot pass what are called bills of attainder. A bill of attainder would declare a person or a group guilty of a crime and punish them without trial, right? It would, in other words, specify the crime to a person, right? And that would go against rule of law. An ex post facto law would do the same thing. What is an ex post facto law? It punishes someone for a crime that wasn't a crime when they committed it, right? So they didn't have notice. They didn't know what the law was. They didn't understand it. Therefore, it would be unfair, unjust, and unequal to apply it to them, right? You see how that works. So that's rule of law that is in the Constitution itself, right? And then finally, I think I'll just give a historic example because we have a couple and I like a good historical example. So why not go to Abraham Lincoln, right? And I think maybe one of the more powerful examples of his commitment to the rule of law is how he reacted to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision of 1857, where the Supreme Court said not only was the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, so Congress couldn't legislate on the expansion of slavery in the territories, but it said that African Americans could not be citizens of the United States. Lincoln knew that to be wrong. He gave a speech in June 1857 saying as much. He was very clear about it. But what he also told his audience is that we cannot react with violence or pushing for unconstitutional measures, right? We can't go beyond what's appropriate under the rule of law. In other words, what he said is, look, this is the decision for now. We have to abide by it. No different than while the Fugitive Slave Act is a congressional measure, we have to respect the rule of law. However, that does not mean we cannot get out here and say that it is immoral and that it is wrong and that we should change it, right? But he made that distinction. He said, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't articulate this as wrong or we shouldn't do something about it. But we should be careful about what we do because we do need to respect the rule of law. Because as soon as we don't, what that opens up in terms of threats to the constitutional order is far greater.
Awesome. I think that's a fascinating one to fall on as a real big wrap up really quickly. So the idea of popular sovereignty, that the people are sovereign, the people are rulers, the people are king, fits perfectly connected on a multi-sided coin with natural rights, that you are given rights either by God or by nature, and no government shall take them away. And then following that, we lay out a clear, fair, transparent, and prior known law that we abide by and that we follow it. And if we don't like it, we change it. I think that's a really good way to wrap it up. But even better, was this something that AJ shared from Mountain Trail Middle School in Phoenix? AJ shared that I think that from the moment you are created, all people have certain rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All people have their freedoms because this country was created by the people and it is run by the people and not an all-powerful government. Little popular sovereigntist there, and I appreciate you. And so this is a really fun concept. It's a great conversation. Could you put the rule of law definition back up, Kerry? Yes, I can. And remember, guys, all of these are online, and we do these great briefing documents that you could get, I mean, pages and pages of reading out of, and they're all online. So I just put the links in there. The classes are going to be running today at 2 as well as Friday at 1 p.m. So join us again. You can watch again. You can email us if you have any questions. And remember, every single week, we will see you here. But we all know that you have to leave right now. So have a great day. Nick, thank you so much. That was a really fun class on my 3 favorite big topics.
All right.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you all. Bye, Milo. Hey, nice to see you guys. Have a great day. I'll sit here if you have any questions. I'll hang out. Bye. Nice to see you guys. Smart questions, gang. Super smart group. Per usual. Bye. I'm glad, Lorelai, you liked it. I'll leave that rule of law up just in case we want it. Oh, good. So glad you bookmarked these classes. That's awesome. We love to see your names. I saw a lot of your name today. So thank you, guys. Have a great day. See you, Eddie. Good questions. Eddie, great questions, by the way. Really good thought, like really crossing things and ideas and concepts. Awesome. Bye, guys. Have a good one. Probably should have stopped that a minute ago. Thank you, guys.